Part 1. The Rain That Wouldn't Stop. Knoxville, Tennessee, February 7th, 2020. It had been raining for 4 days straight. At first, no one thought much of it. Tennessee was no stranger to February storms, and in the rolling hills around Knoxville, downpours were just part of the rhythm of early spring. But by that Friday morning, something felt different. The French Broad River had swollen past its banks. Roads that were dry the day before were now underwater. Local officials began closing off bridges, warning residents in low-lying areas to stay indoors and avoid unnecessary travel. But for Harold Miller, a 78-year-old retired electrician and Vietnam veteran, this Friday was supposed to be like any other. Harold lived alone in a modest brick house near Holston Hills, a quiet neighborhood just east of the city. After his wife passed 5 years earlier, he'd filled his days with fishing, working on old radios, and most importantly, spending time with his 10-year-old grandson, Evan. Evan had become the light of his life. The boy's mother, Harold's daughter, Jenna, worked long shifts as a nurse at UT Medical Center. On Fridays, Harold often picked Evan up from school, brought him back to the house for grilled cheese and cartoons, and waited until Jenna's late shift ended. That morning, like clockwork, Harold called the school bus coordinator just to be sure they were still running. "They're a little behind, Mr. Miller," the woman had said. "But yes, the buses are out. Rain's caused some reroutes, but they'll get there." Harold didn't like the sound of that. He'd driven Knoxville roads for decades, and he knew how fast they could vanish underwater. But he trusted the system. He trusted that someone had assessed the danger. He made soup instead of grilled cheese and turned the heat up in the house. The rain lashed the windows as he waited. Just after 3:45 p.m., the call came. It wasn't from the school. It wasn't Jenna. It was from the Knox County Sheriff's Office. A bus had gone off the road near McBee Ferry Pike, a narrow stretch that ran low and close to the river's edge. It had slipped sideways, tipped into a drainage ditch, now swollen into a brown, fast-moving current. The back of the bus was submerged. First responders were on site. Harold's heart stopped. He didn't need to be told more. He knew Evan's route. He knew that road. He grabbed his keys, his coat, and the rain boots he hadn't worn in months. The storm met him like a wall when he stepped outside. He didn't care. 15 minutes later, his old Ford truck skidded to a stop at the police barrier on Old Rutledge Pike. Flashing lights painted the dark sky. Deputies were pushing people back. The road beyond was a blur of water, debris, and chaos. Harold jumped out. "I need to get through," he shouted to the nearest officer. "My grandson, he's on that bus." "Sir, I need you to stay back," the deputy said firmly. But Harold was already moving. A paramedic stepped in. "What's his name?" "Evan Miller, 10 years old, blonde hair, blue backpack." The paramedic checked her radio. Her eyes darted up. They pulled out 7 kids, one still unaccounted for, a boy. Might be trapped near the rear. Harold didn't hear the rest. He was already moving toward the water. Part 2. Into the water. The rain had softened the earth into mud, and every step Harold took pulled at his boots. But he kept going, slipping past the barricades, past the voices shouting at him to stop. His eyes were locked on the yellow half-shell of the bus, its tail end submerged in murky water. Only the front windows were visible above the surface, tilted like a sinking ship. He didn't think about his age. He didn't think about his heart, the doctor's warnings, or the pounding in his chest. He thought about Evan. A firefighter intercepted him at the edge of the ditch. "Sir, it's too dangerous. We've got divers." "You don't have time," Harold snapped. "You just said one kid's still in there. That's my grandson. I'm going." There was a flicker in the firefighter's face. Doubt. calculation, something else. But then he nodded toward the water. Harold stepped in. The cold was immediate and shocking. It bit through his jeans and coat, gripped his legs like iron clamps. The current wasn't fast, but it was strong enough to push. He used his hands to guide along the roofline of the bus, inching toward the back, one foot sliding in front of the other. When he reached the emergency exit, it was sealed shut. The door handle was jammed, maybe crushed in the impact, maybe swollen from the water. He banged on it with his fist. Nothing. "Evan," he shouted, pressing his face against the glass. "Buddy, it's Grandpa." No response. He ducked lower, dipping his head under to check the windows near the rear seats. The water was thick with silt and floating debris. Backpacks, papers, a floating lunchbox. But then a flicker, movement, a small hand against the glass. Harold surfaced, gasping. "He's in there! Rear left!" he shouted to the responders. Another firefighter was already suiting up to enter, but Harold wasn't going to wait. He took a deep breath and dove. The cold stunned him, but he pushed forward, gritting his teeth. He reached the window where he'd seen the hand. Evan was pressed against the glass, eyes wide, lips blue. The water was up to his chest inside. Harold reached for the emergency tool he carried on his keyring. He'd added it after reading about a car drowning accident last year. He'd never thought he'd use it. He struck the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. Crack! The window spiderwebbed. He struck again. This time, the glass gave way with a dull thunk, and the water rushed inward. Harold reached through, grabbed Evan under the arms, and yanked. The boy was limp but conscious, gasping as air hit his face. Harold kicked backward, using every ounce of strength to push them both out and up. His lungs screamed. They surfaced with a splash. Cheers erupted from the banks. But Harold didn't hear them. He was focused on keeping Evan's head above water. The boy was coughing, shivering, clutching to him with what little strength he had. Firefighters met them halfway. Hands grabbed Evan, then Harold. He collapsed onto the bank, chest heaving, the world tilting around him, but he was smiling. Evan was alive. As EMTs wrapped the boy in blankets and checked his vitals, Harold sat soaked in the grass, ignoring his own tremors. A medic tried to get him onto a stretcher, but he waved her off. "I'm not going anywhere," he said hoarsely, "until I see my girl." Moments later, Jenna arrived, hair dripping, eyes wide with panic. She fell to her knees beside Evan, clutching him to her chest, tears mixing with the rain. Then she turned to Harold. "Dad," she whispered, You saved him." Harold gave a weak smile. Wasn't gonna let him go. Part 3. After the flood. That night, the rain finally stopped. In the pediatric wing of UT Medical Center, Evan lay curled under white blankets, his hand wrapped around Harold's calloused fingers. The boy was stable. Mild hypothermia, a few bruises, some scrapes, but otherwise whole. Doctors said if he'd been in that water 5 more minutes, it might have ended differently. Harold had been checked too. His blood pressure was elevated, and they kept him for observation, but he refused to rest until he saw Evan sleeping soundly. Jenna sat in the corner of the room, watching them both with tear-reddened eyes. The hospital walls glowed under soft yellow light, and the storm's distant echoes had given way to silence. Thick, grateful silence. "You could have died," she said quietly. "I could have," Harold answered, voice raspy. "But I didn't." She swallowed hard. "I always thought, when Mom passed, I thought maybe you just gave up. I saw you pulling away from everything. You stopped talking as much. You stopped living." He looked at her, and for the first time in years, there was no guard in his expression. "I didn't give up," he said. "I was just waiting for something to matter again. Then came this kid. He nodded toward Evan. Word of what happened spread fast. Knoxville's local news ran a segment the next morning. Veteran grandfather rescues grandson from submerged bus. There were photos, grainy, wet, heroic, of Harold being helped out of the water, soaked to the bone, gripping Evan to his chest. People started calling, journalists, old friends, local officials. But Harold wasn't interested in interviews. He stayed close to home, to Jenna, and to the boy who had brought life back into his own. A few days later, the school board invited Harold to speak at a safety review meeting. He was hesitant at first, but Jenna insisted. "You're not doing this for the cameras," she said. "You're doing this so it doesn't happen again." At the meeting, Harold stood behind the podium, wearing his one good jacket, his hands still marked with faint bruises. "I'm not here for applause," he said, scanning the small crowd. "I'm here because no one should have to choose between staying behind a rope or diving into freezing water to save their grandkid." He paused. "And if a 78-year-old man can see what's wrong with that, then so can all of you." In the weeks that followed, new protocols were introduced for flood monitoring along school routes. Bus drivers were retrained. Drainage assessments were fast-tracked. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Back home, Harold returned to his usual routines, but something had shifted. His eyes looked a little brighter. He started fixing things again, and every Friday, Evan still came over. Only now, they sat closer, talked more, and sometimes Jenna joined them just to listen. One night, months later, as fireflies blinked over the yard and the sound of frogs hummed from the creek, Evan asked his grandfather something simple. "Were you scared?" Harold didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he finally said, "but loving someone means doing the right thing, even when you're scared." Moral of the story: true courage isn't loud. It doesn't wear a cape. Sometimes it's an old man in rubber boots, stepping into a river because someone he loves is calling for him. And that's all it takes to turn a tragedy into a miracle. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Share this video with someone who believes in quiet heroes, because sometimes the strongest hearts beat in the oldest chests.